Hey everybody, welcome back to Journey to VR. So today is part 2 of the demo showing how to make this effect using the Motion Graphics Toolkit combined with Maya's cloth system. So in part 1 of the demo, we taught you how to get a mesh network to follow along a deforming mesh that's being deformed by the cloth solver. Today what we're going to be concentrating in on is how to use the audio node to drive these sort of audio-driven plexus effects that you see on it, as well as how to use the audio node to tie into a shader and use a little bit of logic to create a shader that creates a strobing or a flashing light. So let's hop into Maya and I'll show you what I've got going on. So the first thing you'll notice is I've taken the cloth solve and I've turned it into a cache just to make things play back a little bit faster when we're playing around with the mesh networks. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and start creating an audio-driven effect on a new mesh network. So I'm going to grab this sphere that's at my origin and I'm going to create a new mesh network from that guy. And if we kind of frame in on this, you'll see that what we have is just a sphere that's been duplicated 10 times across the x-axis. Pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin playing around with this a bit more. So I'm going to take my distribution and just crank that up to something like 64 and maybe just spread those guys out a little bit further, something like that. And we're going to add on to this waiter node a audio input node. So as soon as we do that and we add onto this guy that techno loop wave file, and we begin playing this back, you'll see that obviously the audio spectrum is being represented in the scale of those spheres, but we're not hearing any sound in our playback of our time slider. So how do you fix that? Well, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you set your time to real time, and the next thing you need to do is actually import the audio file into Maya proper, because right now all it's really being used for is the driving of that mesh network. So we're going to go ahead and just jump back up to our techno loop wave file and import that guy in. So now you'll see that when we play this back, we can hear the audio and we can see that audio spectrum. So if you remember that effect in that QuickTime movie, I had a couple of things going on. I had one effect where the audio, the plexus effect was just sort of bouncing, and I did that by changing some of the attributes on the audio spectrum, on the actual audio node. So if we jump into this guy, you can see that we have two different modes. We have a spectrum mode and we have an average mode. And when you put it to an average mode, I'll just do the scale a little bit higher here, something like 100, really make it visible. What happens is it essentially is showing you the audio in time. So this is when the audio hits, and then each frame it cascades down. So you're really getting sort of a history of that time. So you can see every time that the bass hits, we get that spike, and then it just kind of cascades down in time. Now, if you wanted to, you could change the way this is going to be interpolated by using these graphs. So if I wanted to have just the treble show up in that hit, then I can do something like drop the bass lines down, something like that. And you can use all these little threshold things here to make it so that it just sort of starts to register in these little spikes. Pretty straightforward stuff there. Now, if you don't want to see it this kind of time-based effect and you want them all to move, you want it just to be just a kind of a real-time ticker of the volume of your audio track, you can go to your time settings in the audio node and just turn off these steps. So now each one of those 64 spheres is going to move at the same time, and we're just getting a nice little kick happening when that bass is kind of dropping in there. So what we want to do now is we want to utilize what we've just done here, and I've actually got a preset dialed in that's a little bit different, but essentially it's quite similar. But what we want to do is we want to use that movement to drive a shader. So how do you do that? Well, I always like to prototype something on an object that's easy to see, like a square or another sphere, and just make sure that we're getting what we want out of that motion graphics network or out of that mesh network to behave the way we need it to. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this cube and we're going to hook that into that mesh network. And this is a really cool trick. I've showed this once before on Journey to VR. It's going to be slightly different today. But the setup's similar to what we did a few weeks ago. So if we just go to our node editor, and in our node editor, we can go ahead and we can graph the input-output of this guy. So this is really the transformation node. That's what we're interested in. We can kind of take that stuff right there and blow that away. And what we want to do is we want to have this guy's translate Y get driven by that audio node. So if we just jump back onto our mesh network, select that audio node by clicking the select button in the attribute editor, and just go over to our input graphs button and hold down my shift key and click the input graph, you can see that it adds that guy to my current cube selection, or my current cube that was already graphed. So what we'll do is we'll just hit 3 on this guy and we'll grab the out volume to translate Y. So pretty straightforward. So now you can see as we play through this guy, that sphere is bouncing up and down, which is kind of cool. Now I'm going to assign a new material to this guy, and when I do that, it kind of graphs in here. And what I want to do is I want to use that same output to drive this guy's color. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of expand the color out. We'll grab out volume and we'll have it go to red, green, and blue. So now you'll notice that as we play back our time slider here, it's kind of jumping up and down and it's changing between black and white, right? So it's basically just taking that numerical value and shoving it at red, green, and blue, which is cool, but I don't want these smooth transitions through these gray values. I want it to just be sort of on or off, black or white, red or blue. I want it to have a very distinct change in color. So how do you approach something like that? Well, there's actually some really awesome nodes that you can use to help you get that. These were newly introduced in 2016, I believe. So if you just hit your tab key and start typing float, so we're going to work on that out volume, which is a float number, logic. This is going to let me basically compare two values to each other with an operator. It's a little bit of logic, right? So we're basically going to compare the out volume. So if we put this guy to 3, we'll shove that into float A. We're going to compare the out volume to a value, and I'm going to say 0.45. So if it's greater than or equal to 0.45, this is going to run a true or false. It's a condition. It's just going to output 1 or 0, true or false. So we're going to take that and we can use that to drive. We could use that to drive our color. Or in this example, what I want to do is I want to have it choose between two different colors. So we're going to use another really useful node called color condition. So if I just start typing color and jump down here to color condition, what color condition does is it's basically going to give me, either two different colors based on whether that condition flag is thrown on or off, a positive or negative. So what we're going to, a 0 or a 1, and that's basically what this Boolean is outputting from our logic, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to take the out Boolean and have that drive our condition. So now, if I just make this something that's really very obvious, we can switch between, these two colors. So now you can see that basically what I've done is I've just kind of graphed that guy in. So we've got a couple things happening here. If we just hit 2 on this and 2 on this, we'll tidy this up a little bit here. We've got our out volume driving the position of that cube, as well as it going through a little bit of logic that is then basically being used to choose between these two colors that ultimately drives the color of our shader. So now what do we get? We get something that looks like this. So when those bass drums really hit, it basically goes through and shoves on that red flash, which is awesome, super, super cool. Now I've dialed in the colors that I want here with a little preset, so we'll just kind of do something like that. And now what we want to do is we want to take that color condition and have it ultimately drive our shader on our object here. So if we just go to the shader for that guy, go to the textured color for that, and instead of having this offset gain being driven with a little color multiplier in there, we're just going to drag and drop color condition into that guy. So now what we end up with is, if we play this back, a little strobing effect happening based on the volume, right? When it really gets loud, it flashes to white, which is pretty awesome. Now, the other thing that I ended up doing with this is I actually ended up doing a slight version of this that, if we just duplicate this guy, had some transparency. Oops, I don't need to do that. I need to duplicate my color condition. So we'll just duplicate that guy and hit 3. I want this to also drive transparency. So I've got a couple transparency values dialed in here. So we'll just take the out Boolean from that guy. We'll go back to our shader here, and we'll have this guy drive transparency. So now it's going to be transparent, and when the white kicks in, it's going to be a little more opaque. So it's kind of transparent, and then the white kicks in, and it's got that little strobe flash thing happening. So that's super, super cool. So now what we want to do is we want to take these little spheres that are just kind of hanging out down here in my origin and have them go along for the ride of our urban logo. And this is going to be very similar to what we saw in part 1 of the demo. So we'll go back to the distribution node for this guy, and we're going to use a mesh distribution type. We're going to have those little spheres get driven by that set, pretty straightforward. We're going to tell it to flood. And you'll notice when I hit flood here that it adds it in, but if we hit play, they don't go along for the ride, right? Like, they're not really following that urban logo because we haven't attached that input mesh. So like we saw the previous time, we just need to make sure that we grab the output cloth as our deformed object and have that drive those little spheres. So now we've got our spheres sort of bouncing along, going for a ride, and they kind of fly off that guy. When the kick happens, they kind of fly up. Now, I did a few more things to this. I actually added onto this a trails node. The trails node it's awesome. It's super, super cool. So if we go in here and we add on the trails node to this guy, and we rewind and play this back here, you'll see that as this starts to move around here, we're getting some trails. They're a little hard to see, so I'm just going to increase the scale of those guys. But that's a cool effect, but that's not really the effect that I want to have. Really what I want to do is I want to do the connect to nearest, and what connect to nearest does is it goes through and it starts to join these guys together in a kind of a fun way, but I need to have a lot of these in there. So we're going to say something like 3,000, and if we play this back now, you can see those guys are basically going through, and they're kind of joining together a few of these little cages here, but we're not seeing a lot of interconnection between these objects. So if we start to increase the sub-connections between this, we can start to get to this really nice effect of that kind of cage being built up. And you'll notice that these wires that are basically getting connected are just flat little ribbons, and that's not really what we want to do. So we want these to look like tubes also. So to do that, all I have to do is add in a curve. So if we go and make a NURB circle and jump back into this guy's trails node and drag and drop that NURB circle into that, you can see that now we have, and I can decrease the size of that guy, we now have tubes joining those guys together, which look like the original kind of edge tubing that we made. And I can drop down my number of samples on that curve to something like 3, just to give myself a little bit of performance improvement. And the last thing I want to do is just jump back onto this waiter node. And this is a pretty cool trick. You can layer as many of these procedural these procedural nodes, these procedural Nash nodes on top of each other as you want. So I'm going to add on top of the audio node that we currently have a second audio node. And once that is added, I need to obviously add in that song, the techno loop file. And what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to actually use another preset that's going to use a spectrum, but it's going to drive 512 of these guys. So you can see by doing that, it's going to have the bounce happening with our first audio node, and then we're going to have on top of that a second audio node that's doing a spectrum type effect that looks really, really cool. So if we cue this up and play it back one more time, you can see as this plays back, we've got all this kind of fun stuff happening and that little stroby stuff happening, and it's just really, really pretty fun, and I think it's super, super cool. So let me play back the QuickTime movie one more time so we can see this in real time. And that is basically what the effect is. So we're using several different workflows here to get to this end result. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this. If you're watching this on YouTube or on Vimeo, make sure you go back to the area. On the area, I've been recording lots of presentations, demos in Maya and Max and Unreal, as well as interviewing customers and some of the contractors that have been helping us, where they're sharing with us what they think is cool about VR. Finally, we also have many written articles that are, again, super, super useful. There are interviews with our customers where they're sharing with us their thoughts on VR, as well as some of the best practices and things that they've learned on their journey to VR. So please make sure you go back to the area, to the Journey to VR section, to check out all that great work. Thanks again, everybody. Cheers.